Welcome to Revolution Against Evolution. I'm your host, Doug Sharp.
Your co-host, Rich Gear, here as well, and we're very excited to have some guests here. Doug, you want to introduce them to our audience?
Well, David and Ann Harris have been here in Lansing, I think at least once.
Really, only once? I keep
Once
thinking
or
you've been
twice.
here many times, but maybe, yeah.
But we have had him do a conference here at one point in time, and he was originally from Canada, but now he is living in Great Britain and in Wolverhampton. And we're glad to have you as guests on our show. And we also have Marilyn Pierce, who is also going to contribute to this discussion. And today's discussion is a little bit about human trafficking. And David and Ann have been involved in this. How long have you been doing this, David?
It's 2.5 years, 3 years, something like that.
How did you get involved in it?
Well, when I first came across the fact that slavery was very real, I immediately had a heart for those who were captured. I always have a heart for those who are, how should we say, less vulnerable than us. And I got involved with an organization called Hope for Justice. And both Anne and I went to Manchester. That's just over about 100 miles, a little less than 100 miles from where we are. Went to Manchester to train, and we qualified with them. I then took qualifications with an organization called ECPAT, and then eventually found out the Salvation Army are doing a lot of work, and thought, I want to get involved.
Okay.
And we met somebody at a conference we were working on with a leprosy mission, and they told me that they were one of the people who led it. And I said, I want to be involved. So we both went through the training, and we found out about how to work with vulnerable adults and rescue them and take them to safe houses across the country. And we qualified for that. And we've been doing that now for 2.5 years or something.
And then we have Marilyn. This is something I understand that you have had some experience with yourself. Is that true?
Well, in my experience is that I have been involved with an organisation called Hope into Action, which is a charity that I work for, and we do take in people who are vulnerable or homeless, and we've had two particular people that have been involved in slavery. One was kept living in a caravan on a farm, and he was put to work. Long story short, he managed to escape, and he ended up in one of our houses. And at the moment, he's got his own business and living in his own property. So I've had experienced modern day slavery has been I wouldn't say a lot, but it's enough to know to come on board to understand that the plights people have, with these people. It's very interesting, and my heart is actually in the place now where I would like to do more for people who are in this situation. So what the other chap who got involved, he was very badly abused in using him to work, and again, without going into too much detail, he managed to escape to a place in Wolverhampton, and then we heard of him, and then we took him on. He lived in one of our houses. We have 7 houses in total, and he lived in one of our houses. He started a job, and in that particular job, he just went from basically glory to glory. He was just promoted, and he now is the manager of a team. Him and his friends got together, brought a car, rented a whole house, and they now live in their own little community, which I think is amazing. It's just amazing to see them turn around from coming from such a place of abuse and just that vulnerable place, and to know that it's happening in these modern days, it's really, it's not nice, obviously. But it's nice when you see them come out of that position and to see them develop and move on to progression.
So where were these two originally from? Do you know?
One was from Poland and the other one was from, I think it was Lithuania.
Lithuania?
I think it was Lithuanian, yes.
Wow. So, a lot of times you think of slaves and slavery coming out of some of the third world countries. You think like maybe places in Asia or Africa, and you find that slavery is all over Europe and all over. It's happening all over the place. They're capturing people, even from America. They're capturing people from America and Canada and England and bringing them, and they bring them all over. They bring them to other parts of the world, as I understand it, where they can't be traced as much, or I don't even know how they even do this kind of stuff. It's kind of amazing to me to see. We've been talking about some of this stuff that it's still number one goes on today, but that actually it's not as uncommon in quote first world countries or second world countries as you might think. It's really ubiquitous, kind of all over the place. Do you know what the breakdown is, by the way? Where the majority of people come from and where they take them to? Is there any kind of breakdown as far as that goes? Do you or David, Rand, any of you have any idea on that? I'm just curious about that.
I think David probably has got some figures. Do you have figures, David?
Anne's better than me at figures.
I was looking at the. We've known for a number of years that there's certain countries, some of them in the like Albania and Romania and Vietnam, that quite a lot of these victims that we pick up are actually we actually transport. But one of the highest, I've had a look at the last year's report on something called the National Referral Mechanism, which is who deals with the sorting out the obviously the transport and everything else for these. And the UK was the highest source country. We've transported people from England, Wales, Scotland, America, Belgium, all sorts of different places. But the highest is the UK. And what is really shocking is it's children that are the highest in that group. There's children that get into slavery. Children go missing. They get them into crime because the police go easy on them.
Tell me about the guy from the job centre.
Yeah, there was a chap came out of the job centre some years ago.
He was English.
Yeah, he was English. He came out and someone asked him and said, "Oh, have you managed to get a job?" He said, "No, I can't get anything." So they said, "Have you got any family? Is there someone who can help you out?" And he said, "No, I haven't got anybody." They said, "Well, look, we might have an opportunity for you here. Just get in the van and we'll take you and give you a job." 9 months later, he managed to escape from them. He'd been captured, he'd been working for them, and he just couldn't get away. But this sort of thing happens
7 days a week, like 16 hours a day.
Locked up. And people get transported across the channel. They get picked up at, by immigration. There's all sorts of different ways. But there's people in this country going missing, get trapped into jobs. We've taken a few like that.
It's my heart to produce a traffic proofing training session so that people can know, number one, how to avoid it, and number two, if they end up in it, how to get out of it. Because people just don't know.
Children get duped online, go out to meet somebody and get trapped into something.
Do you find that it's worse today, or has it always been the same, or was it worse in the past? It's kind of shocking when we hear about this now. We're hearing more about human trafficking, but that it exists at all is shocking. But is it greater, the same, or less than it's been in the past?
A lot worse. When Abraham Lincoln, abolished slavery in the United States, when William Wilberforce, some 30 years or so before that, abolished slavery in the UK, they didn't. They made it illegal. But it just went underground. It was not abolished. And that is so sad. I'm not speaking against them. They did a great job, but it went underground. But at that time, the total in the world that we can estimate that were slaves were 4 million. Today, it is over 37 million.
Wow.
At that time, adjusted for inflation, the cost of a slave was much more. Today, you can buy a slave for about $110. Back then, 200 years ago, it was $32,000 on average for a slave, adjusted for inflation.
Amazing. Oh, wow.
Life
It's
is so cheap.
It's always been around, and although the numbers that are getting out of slavery seem to be increasing, I think it's just more awareness.
Yeah,
The police are better trained as the years go on, and I think
yeah.
it's always there. We're getting on top of it slowly, but it's still underground.
Yeah.
There's still a lot there.
To
I
illustrate
think
it, some years ago in the UK, the one slavery master or group of people it was had got 23 Chinese people to pick cockles off the beach, shell food. And they were on the beach and their vehicle broke down to pick them up. So they got trapped by the tide. And the person who was doing it said, well, I can't go now because the authorities will be there. So we'll just leave them. We can buy some more anyway. And they all drowned.
That got in
Wow.
the news.
They're cheap, so it doesn't matter.
Mm.
And that's heartbreaking to me.
it is heartbreaking, definitely.
Now, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was going to ask, do the slaveholders feed these people, clothe them, give them shelter? What happens to them when they are enslaved? Are they sort of trapped in a jail of some sort, or how does that all work?
For those that I know of, those two that I particularly know personally of, they had very, very little, a weekly amount to live on. If you consider somebody in a caravan, no electric, no running water, that's probably given £5 a day, which I'm not sure in dollars that would be, that's just a few dollars a day, or maybe
$8, yeah.
there you go, or £20 a week, and they are left really to fend for themselves. There are people who like these slave masters, so to speak, who run houses, will rent a house, and they will have people, slave labor people, living in this house which will be overcrowded and are health and safety wise, they're very unsafe to live in. I've seen programs on them, and it's really appalling, the conditions that they live in. So they live on the basic amount.
And I'm also curious as to what kind of mechanisms do they keep these people enthralled to them? Why don't they all want to escape? Is it psychological? Is it physical? Or is it a combination? How do they keep them so they don't all want to run away,
It's all kinds. I'll just mention one thing. I'll translate one word from Marilyn. When she talks about a caravan, it's a house trailer.
Oh, good call on that, because we got caravans up here and they're not house trailers.
They're not, but that's the British term for it.
Is it really? Thank you.
It depends really on who it is employing them, where they're from. A lot of the time, if they're brought say from abroad, they get in debt to the person who's bringing them over, and they say, I can bring you over, I can get you a job, your transport will cost this much. They're getting so much debt that it's basically like 200 or 300% what they're getting in income. They can never pay it off.
Yeah, they do that with a lot of the illegal immigration that goes on. They call them coyotes. They'll bring people in, but they owe them so much money they can never get out, and so they're always. Is it kind of like that then?
Sometimes they threaten their family, or they threaten to do something
You do that too, yep.
or to their family if they escape. If they're bringing them from abroad, they'll get someone to dress up in a police uniform and go and either beat them up or rape them. And in some countries, because the police are either complacent or actually involved, they don't. Foreigners, they don't know, they can't trust the police, and a lot of the times they can't even speak English, so they're frightened. They're too frightened to do anything.
So when you go to rescue one of these people, you call it a journey. What does this kind of look like? Is there a risk that you have at the point of contact? Could you tell us a little bit about how that works?
Yeah, when the people are spotted, it can be various ways. The police can find out about it. The anti-trafficking organizations can, even the general public. And there's various different things that happen there. At that point, if, for instance, it's the police that rescue them, they go in there and take them out. We had one very close to us nearby, a Chinese restaurant, where there were, 8 or 9 slaves that were rescued from the Chinese restaurant. That's less than a mile from where we live. And there was the American lady who's not far from us as well. She was rescued by somebody who was just a general public member, had no idea about slavery, but saw her on the side of the road and said, "Look, what's happened?" She just got out of the house trailer she was in, so that where she'd been kept. She'd been locked in a closet for quite some time since she came to the UK, and she was petrified of these slavers. And we took her to a safe house way up north, and we always take them at least an hour away. This was probably about 150 miles away. We always do that so they don't get recaptured. But there's all kinds of ways in which they can be kept, and they can be kept in a shipping container, in an old warehouse, and they're given the minimum amount to survive.
By the time we pick them up, they've usually been taken to a place of safety and perhaps processed by the police or immigration or anything else. I mean, this one was just one that they'd contacted the Salvation Army. They'd got her papers to allow her to stay in the UK, and we picked her up from that person's private home to take her. But we can pick them up from police stations, hotels, anywhere that they've got them in a safe location, so we can transport them to a safe house that's totally safe.
Yeah. What happens to us is we get a text through on our cell phones explaining who the person is and where they're going to be transferred from and to, and at what time. And then we say, "Oh yeah, I'm available," and sorry, I'm not available, but I'm available. And then we set up to take the person. Sometimes we don't even know where the safe house is. We're just given a rough area. So it is tricky. But then again, it's need to know, and we don't need to know. We just need to get them there.
Kind of almost reminds me of the Underground Railroad. They didn't know the next point on their destination. How do you guys get, or how do the organization or whoever you belong to, how do they get wind of a person that needs to be rescued? I'm just kind of curious how that whole contact situation, or the whole, how do you get together, especially as if sometimes the people, they don't speak the language or they're afraid of the authorities. How does that bridge get crossed? I mean, obviously there's got to be a lot of creative ways, but if you give me an example or two, it'd be interesting. I'd like to find out about that. I'm just curious.
Well, once they've been rescued by the police or various other authorities or different people, or it can be even the local government can rescue them. Then they go through what's called the national referral mechanism. They determine whether or not they are actually trafficked. From that, if they have been trafficked, that immediately gives them the right to remain and to apply to stay in the country. Like this American lady had been given that right to stay in the country. And then from that, either the Salvation Army were contacted directly, which is the group we work through, or they are contacted by the Home Office, which is the government department that deals with it, to say, "We've got someone." Then they pass it on to us.
I've got an example. We went to pick up one chap, a Nigerian chap. He was only 21. We were transporting him, obviously, a couple hundred miles. But he'd been in the country since he was 7. He'd been got into slavery, into crime, which is often what they get them into. When he got to 18, he was involved in a crime where he was caught with a weapon, and he was arrested, put in prison, and it took a couple of years, but it got through. They obviously went through his case, found out he'd been trafficked. we did part of the journey, but we picked him up for the other team. But he was basically released from prison, and this was the first day of freedom. And we picked him up at the service station, and he wanted to get a meal, but he wanted to take it in the car. He wanted to get going. And he was outside the service station looking up at the stars. I said, "Are you all right?" He said, "I'm free. I cannot believe I'm free."
So he was 14 years? He was 14 years in this thing?
Yep.
Wow.
Prison.
In slavery for the first number of years, and then the last 3 he was in prison.
Prison, okay.
First
And
day
he
of
was free.
freedom.
And he was practically skipping
Yeah.
across the car park.
Took him from jail to the safe house.
Now, how long do they remain in a safe house then?
The government pays for 6 weeks rehabilitation. That's not enough.
I know.
The Salvation Army says we probably need closer to 50 weeks, and the Salvation Army pay for the balance.
Wow. Wow.
It's
To
amazing,
rehabilitate them, get them back into society.
Yeah.
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 There is a lot more publicity. There is a lot more publicity nowadays about slavery, and this is how I've known about it. That goes out from the council, goes out from different organisations now to make the public more aware of slavery, modern day slavery. A lot of people that work in our car washes are people that sometimes are in slavery, probably all living in one house, being paid rent to sleep on the floor. Who's running them. And I know that's a common one as well, and the restaurants. But I think the fact that there is more publicity, leaflets out there that go out to the public to help the people to become more aware is really key for people who just don't know anything about it.
So what would be the difference between slavery and a regular job? You have,
Very good question, yeah. When you think about it, most of us trade our time for money.
that's right, yeah.
Right.
So therefore, we're working for someone. Indeed, there's a book that was written a few years ago called the Servant Queen, meaning Queen Elizabeth, and the King she serves, because she's very much a Christian, and the King she serves is the King of Kings. Even she serves someone. We all do. But the point about it is, are you doing this voluntarily? Can you leave? Can you go somewhere else? Are you forced to do it? There are some things that people are forced to do that we would agree with. For instance, prisoners. They are forced to be incarcerated, forced to work. We're not against that. There are those that are drafted when times of war. And again, if people are drafted to defend the country, that's a different matter. But this is something very different. They are forced to work, often abused, often beaten, threatened, or their families are threatened. They can be sold to others. And that's something that the Bible speaks against, is people who sell other people. They're strongly in the Old and New Testament against that. And they are owned by their master. So that's the big difference between them.
That was a good segue. I thought I was going to ask you about and maybe talk a little bit about the difference between, let's say, the biblical term for a slave or servant and this modern trafficking thing, which just seems to be heavy bondage. We had heavy bondage. The Israelites were in heavy bondage to the Egyptians for a few hundred years, okay? But and so that kind of harkens more to what we see today in some respects, forced servitude, where the biblical thing that through misfortune or bad practice on your part or whatever happens, you are destitute and you become a servant or a slave to another person. But in the biblical, the Old Testament law, you were allowed to be set free after 7 years. You couldn't hold them more than 7 years for a debt, and then after that, if they wanted to be free, they could leave, or if they liked their master, they could punch a hole in their ear with an awl, and they would be their servant for the rest of their life. But it was not about putting them in caravans, house trailers, or little little places of you know, shacks or horrible sanitation. It wasn't about forcing them to do crime or prostituting themselves, you know, that kind of stuff. I know that goes on a lot. That's what I'm getting at. Is like they have the term for slavery in the Bible, but even then there seems to be differences. You want to talk a little bit about? I've been doing a little bit of talking about that, but anything to add to that?
In the Hebrew, the word used for slave is abed, but the word used for servant is abed. You may notice that's the same word, and it's translated as slave or servant depending upon the context and depending upon what the translators feel to do. It's the same thing. But what was happening with the Israelites in Egypt, that started off with what's called debt bondage. Now, debt bondage is not overly different from people saying, I will work for you if you pay me. But it's the other way around. I have a debt, pay off my debt, and I will work for you if you look after me until I paid the debt. That's how it started with the Egyptians. What happened was the Israelites, 72 in total, came into Egypt, and because they had no food, the Egyptians fed them, but everyone was then bound over to Pharaoh to pay that debt off. Now, when the Pharaoh died and a new Pharaoh came in, he decided this is too much of a good thing. I'm not going to let them go. They're never going to be paid for what they're doing. So that became a rather more oppressive type of slavery. But it was still the same word. In the New Testament, in Greek, they talk about doulos, which is also either a slave or a servant. It's both. And you do have the big difference between those who are captured and those who were not. And the scripture speaks very strongly against people who were what is called traffickers or mansellers, depending on which translation you've got. 1 Corinthians, it speaks very strongly against people who trade in that. You're not allowed to sell or buy slaves. They're in debt to you.
But anyway, the slavery though and servant. Even today, we know the difference between we call somebody if somebody's a manservant. There's not really any stigma to that. Although back in the day, they would say we have to know our place, you know, like that kind of thing. But it wasn't like they were not free to go and they could marry who they wanted to and they could do other things. But it changed quite radically. And I know that the slavery in the United States here was quite oppressive in a lot of some places. It wasn't as bad, but the whole idea of being able to buy and sell human flesh is just a bad idea, you know.
Then you have the situation where you, if you're holding yourself up on a higher level than some other person and holding them down in a lower level, that really becomes the basis for a lot of the evils that take place in this world. Well, thank you for joining us on Revolution Against Evolution. We'll see you next time.